everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be ranking the 2021 releases that I have read so far this year. I debated what to do with this video, so I wasn't really sure how to talk about the 2021 releases that I've read. I have read 10 new releases this year, obviously being science fiction and fantasy new releases. But that doesn't really seem like enough to do a tier ranking video. That seems like something that's better left to the end of the year. I also didn't want to do a straight recommendations video because I didn't love all of the new releases that I read this year. And even though I think that there are lots of people who will love the books that I didn't enjoy, it felt a little bit disingenuous to make it a recommendations video. So I thought that the best of all solutions was to just rank the books. There's 10 of them. I'm going to go from the one that I enjoyed the least up to the ones that I enjoyed the most and just talk about them a little bit on the way. So for a lot of these, I have mentioned them either in my monthly wrap-ups, and for a couple of them, I have done entire dedicated reviews. So for the books that I do have entire reviews for, I will link those in the description so that you can go and take a look at them. But for the purposes of this video, I am going to give a very short, like 1 to 2 sentence blurb, just to let you know what the book is about, and then let you know the reasons why I liked or disliked it. And so then you can kind of make your own decision about whether or not this is something that you want to put on your TBR. I will say I haven't made it a point to read new releases for a really long time. Over the past, let's say like 10 years or so, there have always been books that have been on my radar. So books that I've been really looking forward to and books that I really wanted to read. And so I do end up reading a sprinkling of new releases every year. But because I was putting together the channel, I tried to be a little bit more intentional this year about the releases that I was picking up. I read a lot of lists of most anticipated books. I wanted to read some of the books that people were really looking forward to picking up. And so I did intentionally try to select some 2021 releases so that I could give an opinion on whether or not I felt that they were worth picking up. Unfortunately, this does not seem to be the year for science fiction fantasy stories that 100% pull me in or make me want to recommend them to everyone. My let's say top 3 books are books that I really, really liked, that I would definitely recommend, that I think are well worth picking up. But there hasn't been anything where I'm like, you must break your TBR for this. This is the be all and end all. You need to pick it up, put it at the top of your list. I am going to give qualifiers for all of the books that I recommend in this video. So it hasn't been the most fruitful year in terms of brand new favorite fantasy novels, but I have enjoyed a lot of what I read. So this is probably going to be a little bit lengthy despite my best efforts to keep it short. So I will get started and I will leave timestamps for all of the books kind of through the list so that you can jump around if you would like. So the very first book on the list, which means that this is number 10 of 10, is one of the first new releases that I read this year, and that is Dragon Mage. So Dragon Mage is a fantasy novel that came out in January of 2021, and I have read and done a full dedicated review for this, so I will link that below. But the basic setup for Dragon Mage is that this is a fantasy story that takes classic fantasy tropes. So we have a chosen one in the form of our main character, and he has an untapped magical power that he is unaware of and has to set out on a quest with his best friend. So a lot of really classic fantasy tropes in this one. But the author does take those classic tropes and put a more modern spin on her characters. She explores neurodivergence in her main characters, and there's a lot of grappling with self-doubt and self-recrimination and things that you don't see as often in classic fantasy. So it definitely has a modern spin on that character piece. This is a giant book. This is almost 1,000 pages long. And from what I have heard, I unfortunately don't have a paper copy, but from what I've heard is a very, very beautiful copy to get. This is a book that has a ton of positive buzz. Patrick really loved it, so if you are interested, you can also check out his review because that gives a bit of a different perspective than mine. And I think a lot of other people who have read it have really enjoyed it. The reason that it ranks lower on my list, unfortunately, is because I did not connect with the writing style. I found the writing style to be quite juvenile. I thought there was a lot of over-explaining, a lot of really heavy exposition. There was not a lot of room for nuance or subtlety in the writing, and that is one of the things that I focus on. I know a lot of people can read, and as long as there's nothing too jarring in the writing style, then they're fine. It doesn't matter. But I do find that I get caught up in prose. So if you are not someone who does that, then you may end up enjoying this a lot more. I also personally found that a lot of the tropes, a lot of the plot threads, a lot of the ways that the story came together felt very young adult as opposed to adult. And I did not always enjoy the way that the character building was done. So there are characters who become really good friends in this book, and we don't get to see any of that organic process. We don't get to see the turning points or the big moments that build that friendship. We kind of just see two people thrust together, and then we are told that they are best friends and that they would do anything for each other. So that was a little bit disappointing for me as well. I felt like there was a lot of telling and not as much showing. However, if you enjoy classic fantasy, this had a really cool magic system. It definitely went in directions that I was not expecting. There are a lot of twists and turns that I did not predict. And there were a lot of elements where I would have loved for the author to focus a little bit more. I honestly think if this had been broken up and some of the plot threads had been expanded upon, that this could have been a trilogy, for example, that I really, really fell in love with. So if you are interested, then feel free to explore the range of reviews that are out there, but this did not quite hit the mark for me, unfortunately. Coming in at number 9 is probably my most disappointing experience of the year, and that is the novel 1,000 Ships. So this is actually an alternate perspective of the Trojan War. So this is the Trojan War told in the perspective of the women who lived through it, were impacted by it, were influenced by it. I'm not even really sure this falls under the umbrella of fantasy, but I'm going to categorize it there because I don't really know where else to put books, mythological books. So I'm putting it on the list because 10 is a better number than 9, and I wanted to put it here. So this is a book that I looked forward to for a really long time. I love Greek retellings. I love Greek mythology. And the idea behind this, getting to look at the women who were impacted by the Trojan War, was something that I found to be really, really fascinating. I greatly enjoyed Circe by Madeline Miller, and I really like getting that alternate perspective of an already established story. Unfortunately, this ended up being a really fascinating idea that did not have a satisfying execution, in my opinion. In fact, the introduction to the book by the author was my favorite part, where the author talked about her love of classics, her research interests. I really enjoyed all of that, and it made me want to pick up her works of nonfiction, which I definitely will be doing, because I really liked her writing style, and that's one of the things that saved this reading experience for me. This was a very fluid story. It was very easy to work through. It was pleasant to read. It just didn't live up to the expectations that I had for it. People that I think will enjoy this book are people who don't have a lot of experience with Greek mythology, because then a lot of these stories are going to be new. I was hoping that the shift in perspective was going to add some details or add some element to the story that I had not heard before, and I did not get that. So it was not the most satisfying for me. But there's nothing bad about it. It's not painful to read. It's not silly. It's none of those things. It just wasn't what I wanted. But I think if you are new to Greek mythology, if you're looking for an entry point, this is a very easy book to read. It will take only a couple of sittings, and I could see that it would be really satisfying if you're not already someone who is intimately familiar with these stories. So I can still recommend it for beginners who are interested in Greek mythology, but unfortunately it was not the book that I was hoping it would be. The number 8 spot on this list goes to another retelling, and that is Half Sick of Shadows. This is one of the newest releases that I'm going to talk about on this list. This was released in July of 2021, so just this month. No, we're in August. Sorry, just last month. And this is an Arthurian retelling. And if you have been on the channel for any amount of time, then you know I love Arthurian retellings. I love the Arthurian legend. I will read any book about it, at least to cast my opinion on it. And a lot of them I end up enjoying. And the reason that this ended up at number 8 instead of all the way down at the bottom is because by virtue of being an Arthurian retelling, there is some small sense of enjoyment there, just because I really love these characters, I really love this story. The unique spin on this retelling is that it is told from the perspective of Elaine, the Lady of Shalott, which many people know from the poem, The Lady of Shalott. And this is not a character whose perspective I have gotten outside of that poem in any of the other retellings. She has been a character in other retellings that I have read, but I've never read a story that was told solely from her perspective. And I think the intention of the author was to reclaim a sense of agency that is lost in the poem, The Lady of Shalott. And so we get a lot of introspection on the part of the character of Elaine, which sounds like it should be really fascinating and intriguing and something that I would love. But unfortunately, what I felt that we got, and this is how I explained it in my wrap-up, was Arthurian legend meets the CW. This really just felt like a teen drama set in the world of King Arthur. There were a lot of anachronisms. The dialect didn't really fit the story. I did like that the author, so Elaine, for those of you who do not know, is a seer, so she can see the future. And the way that the story is told is that depending on if we are getting the perspective of one of Elaine's prophecies or one of her memories or of her in the present time, the tense of the novel changes. And I thought that that was a really interesting element. And I didn't dislike it. I thought that it was intriguing, but it wasn't really enough to elevate the story for me. I felt that the characters outside of Elaine were still very shallow. We were kind of relying on what we already knew about them. And even for characters in whom she tried to create a bit of a unique backstory, such as Guinevere, for example, I still didn't get as much of that motivation that I wanted. I didn't feel that they were incredibly fleshed out characters. And it just ended up being a bit of a disappointment for me. I think that this book will still have its fans. If you are transitioning from young adult into adult fantasy and you want to read a book that toes that line well, then I think that that would fit the bill for that. If you're just really interested in Arthurian legends and you like that feminist perspective, then I would still say give it a try. Just because it didn't work for me doesn't mean that it won't work for you. But I have certainly read better iterations of that particular trope. So it was not a big win for me, unfortunately, and so ended up near the bottom of the list. Moving up to number 7. This is the only work of science fiction that is on the list, and that is Winter's Orbit, which is a book that came out in February. So this is it's billed as a sci-fi romance, and it follows the story of a young diplomat who was engaged in a political marriage. Tragedy befalls his husband, and he has to be married off quickly in order to secure some political alliances. So he is married to the kind of troublemaker son of one of the minor royals, and it's about their relationship, about the politics surrounding their new marriage. And there's a lot of character focus, especially on the character of Jinan, who is the ambassador who has recently been widowed, or is a recent widower. So there's a lot of character exploration around him. And this could have been a book that I really liked. The reason that it ranked so low on this list is because of that sci-fi romance. So in my opinion, this did not have enough science fiction for it to be a work of, a work of adult science fiction. But it also kind of flagged on the romance. The little bits of romance that we got were really satisfying. I really enjoyed the dynamic between the two characters. I liked the characters individually. I thought that they were very well created. They were very well pieced together. They both had struggles that they had to work through, and I thought that those were handled in very genuine, compassionate ways. but it just wasn't enough. We got little bits and pieces that left me wanting to know more. And I honestly think, and this is not something that is common for me, but I wish that this book would have just leaned into the romance. If this was a pure romance with some sci-fi elements or a sci-fi background, I would have liked it a lot more, because I think that the author was really great at building that romantic tension. She did an excellent job of building up these characters and made me invested in them and in their relationship, but I felt like I was just getting the dregs of that because she was really caught up in this political maneuvering and this kind of quasi-mystery in the background, but I didn't think that that was that interesting, to be honest. So unfortunately, that is why this book ended up lower on the list. I truly just wish that it had been a romance with some sci-fi elements, and I think that I would have ended up wanting to buy a copy and then probably reread it in the future. I think, keep an eye out for this author because, like I said, I really did like her character work and her character building. This book didn't exactly hit the right notes for me, but I would be interested to see what she writes next. So that is how I felt about that one. The next book on this list is a bit of a strange book to put on. So this is The Black Coast, which is a book that I have recently read. So I've read it this month, so I actually haven't talked about it in any previous videos. The little caveat here is that I think it was actually released in the UK last year, but it was not released in North America until February of this year. So I am still talking about it as a 2021 release, despite the fact that the second book comes out later this year. So I don't know if maybe it properly belongs on this list, but it wasn't released until 2021 in North America, and that is where I am. So The Black Coast, just because I haven't talked about it before, is a work of high fantasy, and it focuses on the melding of two cultures. So what we get in the beginning of the book is the main character of Damon, who lives in kind of your quintessential fantasy settlement. He lives along the coast. And at the beginning of the story, the Jacorsha, or the Jacorshi, who are raiders from across the sea, come in on their boats. They see all of these boats in the distance. And the people of the settlement, Damon included, believes that this is an attack. And they are not very well defended. They don't have a lot of soldiers, and they're unsure about what is going to happen. And when the Jacorsha arrive there, it is actually not an attack. They are fleeing their homelands, and they wish to settle along the Black Coast. This is where the book takes place. So they want to settle there. They are not interested in raiding. They have a new leader who has a very different outlook and a very different perspective. And so what happens is that we see kind of the opposite of what we get in a lot of fantasy stories. We see two cultures trying to come together and cohabitate peacefully, and we don't get the battles. We get the strains and the trials that come from two peoples trying to come together. So it was a really interesting perspective, something that I hadn't really read in fantasy before. This is a multi-POV story, so the two main perspectives are the perspective of Damon, who's one of the members of the nobility who lives in the fortress on the Black Coast, and then the leader of the Jacorsha, whose name is Sana. So we get their perspectives, and then scattered amongst that we have, I don't know if it's like maybe six other perspectives, and we get those from varying degrees. And those perspectives, I think the intention of them is to try to build up the landscape of the greater continent and the greater world. So we get people from various levels of the nobility right down to the common folk. We get perspectives of the antagonists, of the protagonists. The only problem is that because this is such an expansive world, and because the author is putting so much emphasis on his world building, from the perspective of the main story in this novel, those other perspectives don't add a lot to the action that we're most interested in, which is the coming together of these two cultures. So it does feel a little bit like you're being taken out of the story sometimes in order to focus more on that heavy world building. And heavy world building has never been my personal favorite thing about fantasy. So that's why this ended up more kind of low middle in terms of books that I have enjoyed this year. But there were a lot of things that I did like. I did like that this was something a little bit unique, something that I hadn't seen in fantasy a whole lot before. I think that the world building that was done was very intriguing. I liked that there are a multitude of different perspectives, that we get characters from different walks of life. We get to see their different experiences. I thought that the writing was very smooth. It was not anything special. It was not overly jarring. It was good. And I did like the characters of Damon and Sana. What I did not like, so a lot of the world building in this book is focused around character, around personality, around your personal sense of identity. So there's a lot about honor. Sorry, had to shift around a little there. There's a lot about honor. There's a lot about personal agency, about identity. And one of the cultures speaks about themselves in the third person, and I really didn't like that. So every time that I heard it, it grated on me. I did not like it, and it really took me out of the story. So to be honest, that probably lost this book like a full star because it was so irritating to me. And that is 100% a personal preference. I don't know. It is something that I did not like. I appreciated it as part of the world building. I think that the author did a phenomenal job of making the cultures and the peoples in this book feel very distinct from one another, which is not always an easy thing to do. Some of the values and ideals were a little on the nose. Like there were some arguments and some kind of philosophical explorations that didn't feel at all subtle to me. But if you are someone who is really interested in different cultures, in that kind of anthropological world building, then I think that this story might really appeal to you. From here, we will go into the top 5 novels. So at number 5 is another book that I have completed a full review for, and I can list that below. And that is The Hand of the Sun King. So this is the only book on the list that is actually not released yet. And really the setup here is that we have a young man who's growing up in a country that has been colonized by a greater power. And he is torn between the identity of his people and the identity of those who have colonized him. And this is a very intimate struggle for him because his parents actually come from opposite sides of this struggle. His father is a member of the population who has kind of come in and taken over, and his mother belongs to the peoples who used to inhabit the land, who used to, be in charge. So this is a very personal struggle between those dual parts of his identity, and kind of talks us through the greater struggle of having this colonial power come in and start to completely wipe out that underlying culture. So this is a very character-focused story. There's a lot of the internal struggle and the internal motivations of the main character. I liked a lot of things about this. The writing was very nice. It focused on an area of magic that doesn't get talked about a lot. There is a big chunk of the book that is devoted to studying for a major exam, and I really like those tutoring/school focused fantasy novels. However, I felt like because there was so much emphasis placed on the main character, I didn't get attached to any of the secondary characters. So I didn't really feel any emotional connection to any of the other characters in the book. A lot of the events that took place, a lot of the moments that should be very emotional or that should have elicited a lot of emotion out of me did not get that reaction. And I think that's just because this was so focused on our main character. Once again, this is a book that Patrick really loved. So if you have any interest at all in reading it, I would suggest checking out his review because that is more of a kind of a gush review. I also did a spoiler-free review, so you can feel free to get more thoughts there. But this is just, it's one that, again, that I really wanted to love, but there was just a little something that was holding me back. I will definitely continue with this. This is the first book in a series, and I really liked it. I liked enough about it to want to continue. I just hope that in subsequent volumes, I will start to feel more attached to the characters, and it will be less about the world building and the magic and the writing. So that is something that I hope for moving forward. Number 4 is another recent read of mine, and that is The Black Tongue Thief. So this is a book that was released in May, and that I read, I believe, I don't think it was last month. I think I read it in June. So I read it a couple of months ago. And this is a story that follows the main character of Kinch, who is a thief. He has been kind of financed through his thieving education by a thieves guild, and he owes them a lot of money. So at the beginning of the book, he's trying to find out a way that he can have a big score and pay back a big sum of this money that he owes. And unfortunately, the crew that he's working with decides to target the wrong person, and he gets swept up in this grand quest that's going to take him across the continents and into a lot of trouble, essentially. This is a book that is almost solely driven by its authorial voice. The author here, Christopher Buehlman, has a very distinct voice. You will know, I think, in the first couple of pages, if this is going to be a book that you will like. This is very funny. It has a very dark, dry, kind of raunchy sense of humor. And if that's something that you like, then I think that will probably be enough to carry you through this book, because it's very well done. I've seen in interviews, I think Christopher Buehlman works as like an insulter at Renaissance fairs, but I could see him being very good at that, because the humor really is top notch in here, and it is a lot of that kind of insulting / self-deprecating humor, and I really, really liked that aspect of it. Again, this is a book that focuses really heavily on some minute world building. There's a lot about different currencies. They have a different system of months and days of the week. Those are not the kinds of things that I care about. I would much rather read a story where focus is put on the characters and on their relationships between one another. But I know that that's something that a lot of people really enjoy. I think this is a very vibrant fantasy world. You get just enough about the history of the world without it feeling like there are info dumps. But again, you get some of those details that I know people feel really adds to the richness of that world building. This got propelled up on my list because I did really like that very distinct voice that Kinch has. I really enjoyed Buehlman's writing style. I am looking forward to picking out and reading other books by him. But it didn't, again, I didn't really get captured and invested in the secondary characters as much as I would have liked. I'm looking forward to continuing with this series and seeing how it changes, if it kind of grows on me more, but I did not feel that sense of attachment to the characters that really separate the books that I enjoy from the books that I love. So that is why that did not end up being a book that I loved, but it is one that I enjoy and that I would recommend, especially if you like humor in your fantasy. And now we arrive at the top 3. So these are all books that I really liked. Only the very last book, the one on the number 1 spot, is the only one that got 5 stars from me, but numbers 3 and 2 were both 4-star reads for me, and ones that I enjoyed very, very much. So the first of the last 3 is Later by Stephen King. So this was one of his 2 new releases this year, and this came out a little bit earlier in the year. And this is a book that the only complaint that I had is that I wish that it was longer. This is a very short book. It's not quite novella length, but it is a very easy one to flip through in 1 or 2 sittings. And we follow the main character of Jamie. So this is a book told from the perspective of a teenage character. So you get some of those coming of age elements. And Jamie has a supernatural ability that makes him able to figure out things that other people can't figure out. And it doesn't tell you on the back of the book what this ability is, so I'm also just going to leave it at that. But I will say that this is a very unsettling ability that Jamie is not really happy that he possesses. And it gets him involved in a series of events that relate to his mom and his mom's romantic partner, who is a member of the police force. So this is one of Stephen King's kind of hard crime novels, but there's a definite supernatural element to this. I found it to be pretty creepy, but I have a very low tolerance. So I thought that there were definitely some creepy moments in here. I thought that the underlying mystery was interesting, and I just really love Stephen King's characters. It could be the weirdest, most off the wall setup, and because it's Stephen King who's writing the characters, I will always really love it. I enjoy his writing style. Not everything that he writes is an instant hit with me, but I thought this one was really good. It is not my favorite, one of my favorites of his, but I thought it was a really solid story. And I think that if it had been longer, if this had been a full-length novel, then it would have had the potential to be one of my favorites. I really liked the hook. I liked the characters. I liked the execution. It's just that I wish that there was a little more for me to sift through. If you already like Stephen King, then I definitely recommend that you check this out. I think it's a fine starting place. There are some multiverse connections that you may or may not get depending on what your cultural understanding of Stephen King and his novels is. But I think that it's a fine place to start. It's very short. It would introduce you to his writing style, let you know if you're going to enjoy other books by him. But I thought that it was very enjoyable. I had a great time reading it. Really glad that I got to it. Number 2 on this list is a book that came out in May and that I did a full spoiler-free review and then a full discussion about, and that is The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. So this is the first book in his Bloodsworn saga, and it is a Norse-inspired fantasy series. So as with John Gwynne's other books, this is a multi-perspective. It has the fewest number of perspectives of any of his books, though. And the characters that we get are really interesting to follow. So we have a mother character who has an unknown and violent past. We have an escaped thrall. And we have a member of a high-ranking house who is trying to go out and seek glory. So all really compelling, really fascinating perspectives. This is a bit bleaker than John Gwynne's other books, fashioned after that kind of austere and bleak tone of the Norse sagas. John Gwynne is a huge Norse mythology buff. He definitely knows his stuff. He did a great job building the atmosphere and with the world building of this story, and I think that it is the strongest entry-level novel of any of his series. It starts off with a great exploration of the characters. There are some that I felt more immediately attached to than others, but by the end of the book, I really wanted to know what was happening with all of them. I really liked those Norse-inspired elements in terms of the magical creatures, of the animal companions, so really enjoyed that element of it, and I just love John Gwynne's writing. I really love how he develops his characters. I really love how he develops his stories, and I think that they just build and build and build and get better and better as time goes on. So I had the best time reading this. I had a fantastic time discussing it with other friends from BookTube, and I cannot wait for the next installment to come out. John Gwynne has fast become one of my favorite authors, and my one complaint is that I have run out of things to read. I binged through everything he had since February of this year, and now I have nothing left, and that is really, really sad. But would definitely recommend that anybody read this, that you add it to your TBR. The only reason that I say don't break your TBR and throw it to the top is that it is the first book in a series, and we are going to have to wait until next year to get the next one. So you do have some time. And if you want to make that less painful for yourself, then I guess you can hold off a little while until it's closer to the next book coming out. And that leaves us with our very last, or my very last 2021 release. And this was a huge surprise favorite in terms of the books that have come out this year. And that is Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon. So this is a book that will definitely not be for everyone. There are people who would read this and be like, I cannot believe that this is Sarah's favorite release of 2021. But it is a blending of fantasy, science fiction and literary fiction and weird fiction. So if you like those things, if you like strange literary fantasy that explores social issues, then you would enjoy this book. If you don't like those things, then you probably won't like this book. But it really, really hit all of the right spots for me. This is the first book by River Solomon that I have read, but I really enjoyed it. Would definitely read more. It's focused around the main character of Vern, and in the opening chapter of the novel, she is in the woods giving birth to twins on her own. So she has run away from this compound that she grew up on, and she believes that something has been done to her there, but she's not really sure of what. And so she's lost, alone. I believe she's 15 when the book starts, and she has just given birth to twins. And it's about how she navigates motherhood, personhood, how she reconciles her past with the kind of person that she wants to become. It does a great exploration of trauma, how the traumatic elements from our past can impact the choices that we make in the future. It does a really good job. It's very nuanced in terms of the impact of trauma and the people who perpetrate it against you. And when those people are members of your own family, people that you love and that you feel attachment to, and how complex that setup can be. I don't think River Solomon pulls any punches when it comes to really exploring the impact that that can have. I thought it was phenomenal. It did such a good job in showcasing how the people that you care about the most can hurt you the most, and how it can be really difficult to move past that, but sometimes you need to. Vern was a phenomenal main character. I loved reading from her perspective. This is a short novel, but it didn't feel incomplete. I felt like I got the exact story that I wanted and the exact story that I needed. The action, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, the resolution, everything was perfect. I don't think that I would change anything about this novel. Again, I don't think it's going to be for everyone, but if you like that weird, complex melding of sci-fi, fantasy, and literary fiction, and you like books that can explore societal issues and give you a different lens or a different perspective through which to look at them, then I would highly, highly recommend picking up this book. It is a definite 5-star reads. It is one of my favorite books of the year, and I'm so glad that I read it. I picked it up because of a recommendation that Angela had made from the Literature Science Alliance on her channel. And then when I saw it in the bookstore, it had such a beautiful cover that I thought, oh, well, I'll buy this. And I am really, really glad that I did. It is my surprise top contender for 2021 releases. And that is everything. Those are the 10 books that I have read this year. I would love to know if you have picked up any of these 2021 releases and what you thought. Are there any different releases from this year that you have read and that you would recommend? Because even though I haven't had time to read them yet, then I can definitely fit them in later in the year. And I would love to know if there's anything that made a huge impact on you. I apologize, this was lengthier than I had intended, but that's the way it goes sometimes. I will add the timestamps, and I will see you with another video soon.